He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Paris, and more recently has been studying theology at Christendom College. He is the author of 2 books, including an entrepreneurial theory of the firm. Previously, Dr. Sautet has worked as an economist in the public sector in New Zealand and the private sector in Europe. He has also taught economics at the University of Paris, New York University, and as a fellow of the Mercatus Center, he taught graduate courses at George Mason. Today, Dr. Sautet will be talking about the ethical concerns raised by the free market and how we are to respond. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest today, Dr. Frederic Sautet.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Hillsdale, I've never been, it's my first time, so I'm very excited. I've heard so much about this place, and I was told there's always snow, it's very cold, so I guess I'm not disappointed. It's indeed the case. Today I'm going to talk about the market and ethics, and especially the case of entrepreneurship. And as you may have heard in my bio, I'm not a moral philosopher. I have no special training in ethics. So I'm going to basically give you a presentation of ethical concerns, but from the perspective of an economist, from the perspective of someone who studied economics, and especially Austrian economics. So I'm sure many of you are more familiar with ethics theory and moral philosophy than I am, and so please be nice to me if I'm not, going in the direction you think I should be going, but I'd be very pleased to hear from you if, there are holes and problems in what I'm presenting. Now, the reason why I think economists, even though they're not really trained in moral philosophy, at least not anymore today. They used to be if you go back to the 18th century when economics was part of moral philosophy. But the reason why it's important, though, to talk about ethics is because as economists, we have a very important role or advantage, comparative advantage, which is we know and understand how economic relationships and how the market system works. And therefore, I guess we can make value judgments or provide propositions and moral theory about the market system, knowing how the system works. And I guess the big issue in this realm, like in many other realms, is that you have moral philosophers who actually do make statements and give propositions about the market system, but they actually don't know anything about economics. So they end up, making interesting propositions about human beings and what they should or should not do, but in complete or partial ignorance of what economics is. And I would be of the view that unless you have a very good understanding of economics, it's very difficult to make moral propositions that involve economics. Okay? So from that perspective, it's actually a good idea to start by being an economist if you want to make ethical propositions in that realm. Now, of course, a moral philosopher could tell me the opposite, right? I'm making moral propositions and in the realm of economics and ethics, but I'm no specialist of ethics, so I don't know that other side, which is true. But at least I'm starting from the point of the market and the way it functions. Okay. So that is my. That was my first slide, which is why do we need economics? Why as economists can we? How can we use economics to make ethical claims? Well, we can, because unless you know economics, you cannot really make ethical claims. The second point I want to make at the beginning of this presentation is this one, which is to be value relevant, economics must be value free. And that's simply the idea that if I tell you that the minimum wage under standard market conditions reduce unemployment. Say I am Alan Kruger, the current advisor to President Obama, who has famously written a book on the minimum wage in the 1990s with Professor Card, in which they make the claim that actually unemployment is not affected, or employment is not affected by the minimum wage in certain industries, and especially in the fast food industry. And their view was the fast food industry can be seen as a monopsony. So when you have a monopsony, the increasing a minimum wage above the market clearing level will not create unemployment. So if to go back to the point I'm making here, if I'm telling you, and I work for Alan Kruger and a bunch of others, I'm telling you the proposition that the minimum wage will not create unemployment, even if it's set above the market clearing level. And if you know where I'm coming from, if you know my personal biases and so on, and you say, "Ha-ha, this guy works for Alan Kruger, I know, so I'm not going to believe what he's saying," right? Well, you would be right, actually. You shouldn't believe what I'm saying. But the problem with this would be that I could not use economics in order to make an ethical claim if my propositions are not value-free. If my propositions are tainted by my own biases, right? If you know where I'm coming from and what I'm trying to establish, meaning I want to show that the minimum wage is not going to have any impact on unemployment because I have some ultimate motive. If you know this, you can discount it, and therefore you can also discount any ethical claim I can make about the market, right? So unless we do have, we can come up with propositions that are value-free, meaning completely devoid of any biases that the economist may have. Unless we can have this, we cannot really have a discussion about ethics, okay? So that's a second very important point here I want to make. This point has been debated over and over again. Just a few days ago, I was actually in a debate with a professor from University of Pepperdine. His name is Andrew Jungert, and he's a very smart guy, and his entire research program is to show that economics is not value-free. That whenever economists do economics, they have ulterior motives that are somehow included in their research. And my response to this is that he's confusing the idea of science as a research program in which people do have ultimate motives with the idea of having scientific propositions. Here we're talking about scientific propositions in the form of if A, then B, okay? And we want those propositions to be value-free. Now, when I engage in research or when I do economics at the Treasury of New Zealand, as I did for many years, I am definitely not value-free. I'm doing it with certain values in mind, the values of the Treasury, the values of whoever is hiring me, and so on. So I'm using the tools of economics with ulterior motives, and I'm going to twist the data a little bit, torture them so that they say what I wanted them to say, and so on. That's for sure. But in the case of what I'm talking about here, I'm saying we can have, what we're talking about is proposition in the form of if A then B, and those have to be value-free if we are to talk about ethics and economics. Okay. So let me, since now I have mentioned those issues, let me talk about entrepreneurship, since this is what it's all about here. I don't know how familiar you are with the idea of entrepreneurship in economics, but to be brief, there are two ways of looking at the subject. The first one is to look at it from what I would call a behavioral perspective, which is pretty much what everybody talks about when they talk about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is really the whole idea of starting a business identifying opportunities, starting a business, and doing the whole thing that goes with it, finding funds and so on, in order to invest and exploit profit opportunities that you've discovered. So it really is in the mind of researchers, but also in the mind of the general public, embodied in very famous people such as Bill Gates and others. So that's one view or one approach to entrepreneurship, which is fine, which has its own domain of study. Entrepreneurship studies do study the behavioral aspect of entrepreneurship. But as you can imagine, with me making those comments, that's not what I am interested in. I'm more interested in the second one, which is the idea of cognitive entrepreneurship. Now, that term in itself is not necessarily the best, but what it means is basically it's looking at what distinguishes entrepreneurship as a function in the market system from all the other functions that we have identified. So we know that in economic theory you have entrepreneurs, but you also have consumers, you have people who save, they're capitalists, you have people who are landowners. Traditionally, these are the major functions that you find in the textbooks. And entrepreneurship is, at least in the old days, was the fourth function, the one that would come, afterwards. And it's called cognitive, or I like to think about it in a cognitive way. Why? Because it really is about the discovery process. So the idea that the entrepreneur is the individual or the function that is going to bring new information into the system. So we're not in a system that is closed, that is in which we know pretty much all the ins and outs. We're in a system that is open, it's an open universe, and the entrepreneur is going to be, or the entrepreneurial function embodied into the entrepreneur is going to be the person bringing that new information into the system, okay, and enriching the system with new information. And by the way, since I mentioned that my talk would use some sources from the scholastic tradition, Thomas Aquinas himself talks about, in the Summa Theologiae, talks about human beings or man as second cause. So the first cause is God, the immovable cause, but he sees human beings as second cause, and he sees it in an ontological way, in the sense of truly bringing new information into the system, information that was not there before. Okay, so Aquinas in some ways does have a very similar understanding of what the entrepreneurial function is as economists in the Austrian tradition from Menger to Kurzner, okay, for those of you who know about it. All right, let me explain maybe in a very small example what the entrepreneurial process is. And Dr. Praxis knows this example by heart. He's seen it at least 25 times, so if you fall asleep, doctor, that's okay. But the way I like to illustrate this is, imagine we have a market for apples, and there are basically two markets, one in Washington State, that's where often enough, from what I understand, apples are being grown in the US. There are beautiful orchards in that place. And we're in Hillsdale, where there's a lot of snow and it's cold, and our orchards don't really work well. And as you can see, it's reflected in the price of those apples, which are exactly the same goods. You can buy a pound of apple for $3 in Washington State, and if you're in Hillsdale, you buy it for $4. Now, any one of you who studied Economics 101 would say, well, pretty normal. It takes, obviously, Hillsdale and Washington State are not next to each other. So it's going to take resources to bring the apples from where they're grown to where they're consumed. So the fact that there's a price difference is just an illusion that the journalist from Newsweek would not understand, but since we have good training in economics, we know that this difference can be accounted for by various transaction costs to bring the apples from Washington State to Hillsdale. Right. Now, let's imagine that you're actually from Washington State and you're a grower, an apple grower, and you happen to be in Hillsdale visiting Dr. Pungracic, and you notice that the price of the apples are $4 while you're walking around, right? You're like, $4? No way, that's impossible. It's impossible, and very quickly you do back of the envelope calculation and you realize that, aha, indeed, there's a problem. The apples are way more expensive than they should be. Because you're an apple grower, you know about the market, you know about what it means to, what it takes to bring apples from your state to various places, and you realize that there is a problem here, and the problem being there's a price discrepancy that cannot be explained just by the cost of transporting the apples from one place to another. And you go forward even more, and you realize with your little back of the envelope calculation that actually it would cost only 60 cents to bring the apples from one place to another, including all the capital costs, meaning even if you had to hire trucks or to buy trucks, to get a loan from the bank to buy those trucks, even once you include all the capital costs you can imagine in order to do this, it's still only 60 cents per apple. So what does that mean? That means there's a price discrepancy, and this time a real one, not just an illusory one, a real price discrepancy of 40 cents. So there is 40 cents that cannot be explained by the state of the market as it stands today. There's a problem in the sense of people in Hillsdale are overpaying for what they obtain. They're overpaying compared to what people in Washington State are paying, in a true sense of the word. It's way more expensive than it should be by 60 cents per pound. And since you're a good entrepreneur and you understand the business, of course what you could do is buy apples in Washington State and decide to sell them in Hillsdale for $3.90, for instance. $3.90 you'd be 10 cents below the market price currently, and you would pocket an entrepreneurial profit of 30 cents. Okay? Now, what happens in? The price in Hillsdale of apples is going to start going down, right? And as you all know from your Econ 101 class, marginal cost equal price is what you get in equilibrium, right? Here we don't have that, but we'll add that with entrepreneurs realizing that indeed there is that price discrepancy that is bringing them into the market. So somebody else may come in and say, $3.90, no, I'm going to sell them for $3.85. Or you might, do like the guys at Whole Foods, put a nice place, sell them for $3.90 with lots of space where, liberals can come and drive their Beamers and buy apples, right? I mean, that's one possibility. So competition will drive down the price of the apples in Hillsdale through the discovery of entrepreneurs. And that's what happens all the time in markets, okay? You all know this, but I just wanted to make sure we understand that this price discrepancy that remains once all the costs have been accounted for is the one that we're talking about, is the problem in general when people talk about entrepreneurship and profit and ethical issues. Now, example of real entrepreneurs, for those of you who don't know, Gustav Swift is one that I like very much. He's the guy who basically brought meat to the average man in the U.S. Before Gustav Swift, you had to bring the cows into big centers. If you lived in New York, you had slaughterhouses in downtown New York. And there would be blood all over the place. It was terrible. It was not very healthy and safe. And Swift realized there were two things going on in these days, in the 1870s. One was the development of the railroads, the other one was the development of refrigeration. And he said, oh, how about we put a fridge on the train? And that's what he did. And by doing this, what happened? He was able to outsource the slaughterhouses outside town centers, and they would make them big. The plants were big, so he could reap economies of scale. So that meant the price per unit, price of production was going down per unit of cows being slaughtered, and the price of meat went down slowly. From when you look at the history of the price of meat, between 1870 and 1900, it's being divided by 5 times or 6 times. And more people started eating meat at the time. The story, which is not necessarily nice, is that he's the inventor. That's terrible, I cannot go back.
If you go on the keyboard. Oh, there you go.
He's the inventor of there we go. He's the inventor of the disassembly line. So people often say Ford, along with Frederic Taylor, were the inventor of the assembly line in production. Actually, Ford took that idea from Swift, who, as you can see, was using the assembly line to disassemble, so to speak, cows. That's an example of one of those fridges that I was mentioning before. So why is that important? Because it's important because you realize that opportunity just like the apples, right? And it's a very interesting case of arranging, combining resources in a new way, as Schumpeter would say. Now, that's another much more recent example. I was actually having a talk with the owner of Right Post just a few days ago, last Tuesday, because they're part of there's a new entrepreneurship center in DC with lots of high-tech guys, and so I went there with a few students, and we had a talk with those guys. I mean, they're in their 20s, late 20s, very interesting entrepreneurs. What they realized is they were poor students traveling throughout Europe, and realized that throughout Europe they could hitchhike and share cars or whatever very easily. In the US, not possible. Everyone likes to be alone in his car. So what they said is, well, we are all MBA students. We know people react to incentives. So why don't we make sure we pay them to share their cars, and I'm sure the market will develop. They sense that, and actually their startup is growing super fast now. And if you're interested, you can be either on the driver's side or the passenger side. Go onto their website. It's a cool one. Anyways, so all to say, now that we have a short understanding and presentation of what the entrepreneurial profit is, my first question that I want to discuss tonight, I guess, is the issue of justice. Is that profit that we saw, and remember, it's a profit that does not correspond to any deployment of resources. It's not because I'm deploying capital to bring the apples from Washington State to Hillsdale that I'm being paid those 30 cents. Those 30 cents are what remains once all those costs have been paid. Okay? So it is a big deal. It is a big deal because the entrepreneur, at some level, you can perfectly argue that the entrepreneur does not deserve what he's obtaining. There is no labor involved, there's nothing involved that would justify the entrepreneur pocketing those 30 cents. So the question of, is entrepreneurial profit just, or can one say that it is rightfully the entrepreneur's, is a big one, and has been contested, I guess, for a long time, at least since Karl Marx and others who have looked into the issue and saw the huge discrepancies that can exist in market incomes. So is this a just profit? And again, here I'm starting from the perspective of the economist, not from the perspective of the moral philosopher. Because unless you understand why that profit is here, you cannot really make a moral judgment about it. Okay? All right. Karl Marx, I always like to see his face. I have a picture of him on my door at CUA that everyone loves to see this. But it's actually a caricature, but it's based on this. John Bates Clark. John Bates Clark, those of you who know him, is probably one of the most brilliant economists of the late 19th century. And he actually attacked head-on that problem of distribution in the marketplace. And basically, what he demonstrated in his work is that all the factors of production in the market system receive their value, or receive a value that corresponds fully to their contribution to the system. So every income, be it the wage that is given to the laborer, the interest that is given to the capitalist, the rent that is given to the landowner, all of that, if you are in a situation of equilibrium, all of those incomes that accrue to the factors of production correspond to actually perfectly to the contribution of each of those factors to society. So basically, Clark said, as far as those factors are concerned, we're just fine. There are two main issues though. Number one is the initial endowment. Well, what is the initial endowment? Well, if you believe that you are much smarter than your neighbor, or rather that your neighbor is much smarter than you, and your neighbor therefore is able to derive much more income than you are, if you believe that this initial endowment is fair and is okay because this is whatever God-given, nature-given, and so on, then you have no problem with the conclusions of Clark. Because Clark is saying we all have different endowments, the land is going to be fertile in different way and so on, but this is going to be assessed by the market, and at the margin everyone will receive their due share. Okay? And if you don't have any problem with the idea that we're all different, then Clark is right. Now if you do, then you start becoming a socialist. And you think, we need to redress something in the universe. We need to actually do something about it. But that's only because you believe that this initial endowment is incorrect. And I'll go with Clark and say, let's not talk about this, that's too complicated. We'll just take things as they are. A good reason to believe the initial endowment is there for a good reason. But the second problem is the special case of entrepreneurial profit. And Clark actually didn't touch that. Why didn't he touch that? Because he was working in the market system as a system in equilibrium. In equilibrium, everyone receives what they should be receiving, right? But if you're in equilibrium, there is no such thing as entrepreneurial profit. The apples should be priced everywhere the same, right? It should be $3 in Washington State, and it should be $3 in Hillsdale. $3.60 once you account for transportation costs, not $4. Okay. So he didn't touch this because he didn't know what to do with it, basically. And that's a big problem because the best mind who's looked at issues of distribution didn't know what to do with that. Well, what's the answer to this? What's the answer to the entrepreneur has done nothing to deserve the profit he is receiving? I mean, that's a tough one. But we can look at what St. Thomas Aquinas has said, actually, to help us there. Maybe it can help us. He's got in part 1, question 77 of the Summa. The question is whether it is lawful to sell a thing at a higher price than what was paid for it. Sounds very much like what entrepreneurs do, right? Buying apples at $3 in Western states, selling them at $3.90. What is the answer to this? He says, if a man sells at a higher price something that has changed for the better, he would seem to receive the reward of his labor. That's as far as he goes. What does that mean? That means he cannot envision the idea of someone receiving an income that has no corresponding deployment of any factor in reality. If you have not labored for it, you don't deserve it. That's what Aquinas says. So the idea of entrepreneurial profit in Aquinas' mind doesn't exist. And actually, if you go farther, 250 years later, the fifth Lateran Council defined usury as nothing else than gain or profit drawn from the use of a thing that is by its nature sterile, a profit acquired without labor, cost, or risk. Now this is in the case of usury, but what is interesting here is this line. The idea that you could acquire a profit without labor, cost, or risk is anathema. It shouldn't exist. Okay? It's not even thinkable that you could have an income that has no correspondence in the real world, so to speak, where you don't deploy your factors, your labor, what you own, your land. If you don't do that, you don't deserve it. It's normal. So if we look at the mainstream of those thinkers in the Middle Ages and so on, they actually cannot give us an answer to the problem of entrepreneurial profit. To be fair to church thinkers, people in the schoolmen of Salamanca did have better answers on profit. But even them were so-so. And this idea carries all the way through to us, to the 21st century, in which a lot of people cannot actually justify the fact that there is such thing as profit, entrepreneurial profit, pure profit. Okay? Now, of course, this man is coming to our rescue. Superman Kerzner. Those of you who don't know Israel Kerzner is a professor of economics at NYU, retired now, emeritus, father, dean of the Austrian school in many ways. He's also a scholar in the Torah. So he's got two lives, but those two lives are important because being a scholar in the Torah, he's being trained in all sorts of subjects, and not only just pure economics, but definitely also issues of morality and so on. Kerzner's answer is to say this: entrepreneurial profits represent not a produced gain, not a windfall gain, but a discovered gain. And maybe it's going to seem completely obvious to you, and I hope it will actually. But what that means is, well, the entrepreneur indeed does not deserve anything because he has not deployed any of his factors or labor or anything to capture the profit. Again, even if he has to hire himself in order to be able to bring those apples from Washington State to Hillsdale, that's already accounted for. He's paying himself a wage, okay? So we're talking about all of that once we've accounted for costs, for all those costs. So what is Kerzner saying is that discovered gain would not exist if the entrepreneur had been around. So in the deepest sense of the word, it's a true discovery, and that's where we go back to Aquinas' idea of man as second cause, capable of bringing new information into the system. So Pure profit, in fact, is going to change the idea of distributive justice. Why? Because incomes are not to be distributed as if it was a pie to be distributed that already is in existence, which is the standard problem in economic theory and in most of political philosophy. No, the incomes are discovered in the course of the market process itself, because it's an open-ended system and a dynamic one. Okay? So from that perspective, the proposition that as an economist you can make is that, well, there's an obvious case of first discoverer, first occupant, finder, keeper kind of story, that you are the one who actually came up with the idea, and therefore you're the natural owner of it, which is very congruent with many of the basic principles of the common law. All right. Let's move quickly to problem B. Problem B being, is the profit the result of greed and selfish ruthlessness? So you could say, okay, the entrepreneur is the owner of profit. That's fine, we agree with that. But please, don't tell me that he was not greedy or selfish or ruthless. Because that's what entrepreneurs do, that's what the market is all about. It's about selfishness and greed. This idea goes back a long way, but one major individual who has promoted this one is Bernard Manville, with the fable of the bees. I don't know if you know about this. It's the idea that the world is working on its own because of men following their own views, which are generally evil. I quote, "What we call evil in this world is the grand principle that makes us sociable creatures, the solid basis, the life and support of all trades and employment." So, at some level, Mandeville is seen as one of the architects of the idea of spontaneous order, but his entire edifice rests on what he calls the vices of human beings, include greed and so on. At some level, Adam Smith did the same. At least, I mean, Adam Smith, he's written so much. It's like the Bible, you can find one thing and it's contrary in the same, book. But one of the things he said is, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we can expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. You can interpret this in many ways, of course, and a lot of ink has been poured on that phrase, but if you see a line going from Manville to Smith and so on, definitely it points in the same direction. John Ruskin, maybe a few of you know him, he's a social critic of 19th century England, a very interesting intellectual of Victorian England. I like to quote him on this because he says that economists and those who read their work with acceptance have entered an entirely damned state of soul. Okay? And why are they damned? Well, they're damned because their vision of humankind and society is that selfishness and greed rule the world, and that's desirable. Okay? And to some extent, all the ideas we hear today around, Wall Street greed and so on, they find their root in those debates, with those guys. So, what I think they say really is, we have to tolerate some form of immorality in order to enjoy the advantages of the market. Right? Something I'm sure you have heard over and over again. So even if we say, yes, the entrepreneur justly is the owner of his profits, now the next question is, but hey, you got all this through greed and selfishness, but we can tolerate this because I like to drive my BMW when I go to Whole Foods. Right? But I know that those guys were not so clear and not so clean. Well, what is the answer here to this problem, conundrum? Again, not from necessarily a moral philosophy point of view, but from the economist point of view. If we go back to this slide from before, you agree that the range at which the price can be sold, the apples can be sold, the range is pretty wide. It can be anywhere between, if all of that is correct, it can be anywhere between $3.60 and $3.99. Okay? And I guess you could say, well, at $3.99, the entrepreneur is extremely greedy. At $3.61, oh, he's really nice because he's thinking about his fellow human beings, and he's only interested in 1 cent per pound of pure profit. So that's the good, nice entrepreneur. The one who's charging $3.99 is the bad one. Of course, that supposes that you can read into people's minds, but the problem, as Wicksteed mentioned, famous English economist of the late 19th century, and I'll come to him in a second, is that the problem with this is we cannot really judge the intention of market participants because we cannot observe their final ends. And you can imagine a case in which an entrepreneur is the most ruthless business guy you can imagine, paying people the minimum he can get away with, and so on, and at the same time using all that wealth that has been created for other purposes that you may see or deem as honorable, I don't know, charity work and so on. So the problem with production and entrepreneurship is that because the final ends cannot be observed, it's really difficult actually to make a judgment about the motivation behind this. Philip Wicksteed, as I said, mentioned this. Lionel Robbins, writing maybe 30 or 40 years after Wicksteed, says, before Wicksteed, it was still possible for men to give countenance to the belief that the whole structure of economics depends on the assumption of a world of economic men, each actuated by egocentric or hedonistic motives. For anyone who has read Common Sense, which is the book by Wicksteed, the expression of such a view is no longer consistent with intellectual honesty. So Robbins says, yes, Wicksteed is right. It's impossible to read into people's mind, really, ultimately. And actually, if you look back at the great Thomas Aquinas, again, in question 77 that I was mentioning before, does mention the same thing. He says gain, which basically is profit, itself may be lawfully intended, not as a last end, but for the sake of some other end which is necessary or virtuous. What he means by this is, again, sorry for the typo, what he means by this is, again, the other end exists and may exist and it may be virtuous, but we do not know in itself what that virtue, that further end is. So therefore, gain in itself, even though it may be not recommendable, it's fine. Okay? So he's making the same point as Wicksteed is making a few hundred years later. So here, if you conclude from the economics of entrepreneurship, use the economics of entrepreneurship, you can say that the advantages of the market do not rest on vices and morally dubious behaviors. Not at all. That doesn't mean, of course, that it doesn't exist. There's no doubt about it, and especially in one case, which is that the rule of the game may promote that kind of behavior. And I would say the 2008 financial crisis, is full of that. The development of subprime lending and all other dubious securities at a very high speed, which was promoted by various institutional structures in the market can be seen as indeed the rules that promote, at some stage and some point in time, behavior that is morally dubious. Now, does that mean that men will always choose this? Well, they will definitely choose it if the rules of the game give them the incentives to do so. James Buchanan, the late James Buchanan, who passed away just a few weeks ago, used to call this the natural proclivities of men, which I always found interesting considering that he was an atheist. And when you think about the natural proclivities, it's very similar to the idea of concupiscence in Christian theology. So, yes, the natural proclivities of men will manifest themselves in certain institutional contexts more than in others. There's no doubt about it. But the market system in itself does not have to rest on that morally dubious behavior as Mandeville mentioned. So the answer to that second question is no. I guess that's where I finished my talk. I'm told there's 5 minutes or whatever for questions. No, 10 minutes. Unless there's no questions.
I have a question about the cognitive versus behavioral entrepreneurship. Is that also how Mises and is that where Mises and Kirzner kind of disagreed on entrepreneurship, kind of on that cognitive versus behavioral, or were they both more of the cognitive side than just over smaller discrepancies?
Well, I guess it depends on whom you're talking to.
Okay.
If you talk to Kirzner, he would tell you that he's only using Mises' insights, combining them with insights from Hayek on knowledge, and providing a richer understanding of the function of entrepreneurship. But that function of entrepreneurship as arbitrage can be definitely found in Mises' work. There are many passages in which he talks about entrepreneurship in that way. So if you take the side of Kirzner, you would say there's no difference, or the differences are not in that way. There are others who debate that, and within the Austrian school and other schools, and who take a more probably behavioral way, mostly because they think entrepreneurship is more about deployment of resources and judgment, about deploying those resources rather than just a single act of discovery. And they also claim that that's Mises' point. I think Mises actually talked about both. He's got this view of the notion of the promoter in human action, which is very undeveloped, I guess, but he talks about it a little bit in a few sections, and the idea of the promoter is similar, I would say, or is the embodiment of the function of the entrepreneur in a real world setting. So the promoter would be more the behavioral understanding of entrepreneurship, and is entrepreneurship as arbitrager would be the cognitivity. What else?
I actually have a question.
Sure.
I'm just curious to know if you think that morals are about intentions or about consequences.
If morals are driven,
Yeah, or
so
not
moral
driven,
theory,
but
you mean? Or?
yeah.
Well, as you observed in my talk, I purposefully avoided having to discuss theories of morality, and I mentioned that at the beginning. I mean, my personal position would be more of a natural law perspective in the sense of each object as an end, and you can discover through understanding the nature of the object what its end should be. So you can use an axe, or you can use an iPad to stop your door from slamming if you want. That's possible, but that's not what the iPad nor the axe were meant to be. Their primary or final end is to be used to cut wood or cut something, and the iPad to enjoy reading or something. And so the moral question for the natural law person would come from understanding the nature of what you're looking at. But so I don't know if that would be more of a, it's definitely not utilitarian or consequentialist, but that would be more of natural law, I guess. I'm not sure. But again, that's not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't go too much